We are in one of the greatest worship and prayer movements of our history as the bride. It's amazing to see what the Lord has done in the last 10 years and how the church, his bride, longs to adore him and is talking to him and having conversation. And this is just the beginning. What we'll see in 10 or 15 years will be mind-blowing, I really believe. And as we have spent time adoring Jesus, and as we hear his heart and we hear his words, we also realize that he's brokenhearted for the world around us. And then it doesn't take long for us to turn on the TV or our own friends that don't know Jesus and to hear that they're longing for love, longing for identity and acceptance. And so as these two things are happening in our society, it's like, I believe that prophecy in worship is does God design to deactivate the plans of the enemy in the days ahead. You see, love is saying something. Jesus is love. God is love. And God is saying something to humanity. And so that's the idea behind what we want to talk about today. And 1 Corinthians 12:31 says that you should all constantly boil over. I love the way the passage translates this. It says we should boil over seeking and desiring the higher gifts. And prophecy, that is one of those gifts. Sean Boltz, he says, the prophetic is knowing the fellowship and perceptions of Christ, right? What a great summary of the prophetic. And so what happens when we mix together worship and the prophetic? What happens when the two collide? And how do we cultivate that? How do we put that in practice in our lives at home, when we're on the platform as creatives, or we're designing something or painting something? That's what we want to talk about today. So let's start with the basic definition. What is prophecy? What is the prophetic? Revelation 19:10 says the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Christ. So anything that speaks of the testimony of Jesus or the lordship of Jesus, that is prophecy. The Lord is restoring the gift of prophecy because we're hungry for it as a body. 1 Corinthians 12:31, Paul says that we should constantly be boiling over, desiring the higher gifts, right? We should be desiring prophecy. Why? Because prophecy speaks the lordship or Jesus' heart, his perceptions over people, cities, and nations. Secondly, prophecy should encourage, build up, and comfort people. 1 Corinthians 14:3 says, when somebody prophesies, he speaks to encourage people, build them up, and comfort them. That's the Bible. It's telling us, what is prophecy for? Well, does the testimony of Jesus, does it tear people down? The testimony of what he did for us, does it tear us down? No, it brings us life. It brings us freedom, and it propels us into our destiny, right? It encourages us that Jesus did it all. He paid the price, and so I can live redeemed and free. It builds us up, right? It's the testimony of Jesus, what he thinks of me, how he feels about me, his desires for me, and his desire for my future, right? It builds me up, and it comforts me. It comforts me to know that Jesus is in control, that he sees things in my life. And here's what he says, that here's what's going to happen in the future, that here's what my word says, that I'm going to be with you, that I'm not going to leave you, right? That every thought that I have of you is for your good. These are things that encourage, build up, and comfort. And that's what prophecy should do. I want to encourage you to press in. We should press in. Like I said in 1 Corinthians 12:31, Paul tells us that we should boil over, right? We should seek after the gifts. There's nothing wrong with seeking after prophecy. As a matter of fact, there's something wrong if you're not. If you are not looking for the prophetic to operate in your own life, for you to do it, for you to declare the testimony of Jesus, if you're not stepping out there and asking the Lord, speak to me for my family, speak to me for my wife, speak to me for my friends, speak to me for the person at the hospital or at the grocery store or the gas station, man, you're missing out on the beauty and excitement of what it is to be a follower of Jesus. What is worship? Worship is adoring God. It's a showing adoration for who he is, his nature, and his character. It's lifting his name up with no expectation of anything in return except that he delights in being with us. The Bible tells us to show gratitude and give thanks to the Lord for what he's done. But the basis of our love is not on what he does for us, but who he is and who he is to us. I worship him because of who he is. And because of who he is, this is what he does in my life. In our culture today, we tend to have it the other way around, that we see what God does in our life and we define who God is by what he does in our life. And that's okay for a time, but what if we can't see what he's doing? What if we don't understand his nature? Then we're actually worshiping what we get from God as opposed to who he is. Now, why does worship exist? One, it's because he's ultimately worthy. Jesus is worthy. He's worthy of our worship. God is worthy of our surrendered life. God is worthy for us to lift up his name, sing it, express it through dance and painting, express it through an overflowing heart, right, of love and gratitude to him. He's worthy of it. There is no one else worthy of worship like Jesus. Secondly, it exists because it brings us into agreement with God. When we worship God for who he is, right, it brings us into agreement. We're saying, God, I love you. I worship you because you are faithful. Oh, Lord, your faithfulness is forever. And we begin to sing, you are faithful, forever faithful, right? And the whole congregation begins to sing, you are faithful. And the dancers begin to dance an expression that you are faithful, God. And the painters are painting a picture that you are faithful, God, right? The rocks themselves are crying out, you are faithful, God. So we're worshiping him because of an attribute of who he is. And we're coming into agreement. Worship brings us into agreement with God. When we worship with song, we're actually bringing the earth and heaven into agreement with one another. And we're agreeing with who God is. So when you worship in your room, you are bringing earth and heaven together in that place. And you're saying, God, you are faithful. And everything around you, you're creating a space that's agreeing with that too. Is that not amazing? You know that 2 Corinthians 5:18 through 20, it tells us we are actually ambassadors of reconciliation of Christ. We're ministers of reconciliation. So the way we minister reconciliation first, how we do that is we come into agreement with God. We declare who he is. We agree with him, and we're able to reconcile the world back to Christ through agreement. So what can happen when prophecy and worship are operating together? What an amazing thing. Meaning that the testimony of Jesus coming forth as we're adoring Jesus, or as we adore Jesus, then the testimony of Jesus comes forth. Either way, it works amazing, right? Because as we are singing of an attribute of God, or we're singing about who he is, and we're experiencing and encountering his nature, well, then he's speaking and we're testifying to the world around us the testimony of who God is, of who Jesus is. Not only what he's doing today, but what he's going to do in the future. That's what happens in worship and prophecy. So the issue for us today to talk about is, how do we cultivate that? Well, I believe how we cultivate prophecy and worship is by cultivating the art of hearing the Lord. You see, we have to do some intentional things to be skillful at what the Lord's asked us to do. It's not just learning to play the keyboard or sing well or dance, paint well, or run a business well, or paint well, or invent something well, or operate in government well. even though those are important, very important things. But it's also just as vitally important that we take our heart and that we're intentional and that we cultivate an art of hearing. In our society today, this is not normal. This is not something that we hear a lot of. There's so many distractions that literally keep us from hearing. When we hear silence, we turn on noise. Literally, we have apps to play noise so it's not silent, so we can sleep. We play noise to rest. Wow, is that not amazing? You see, there is an art. There is some intentional things that we can cultivate in our lives before the Lord to hear. I want to close our time today to encourage you. Step into it. If you are walking through your day and you're a business owner, you're a boss, or you're on the platform and you're in that moment of worship and it's springing forth in adoration and you feel the impression of, God, you are faithful. And then he brings a scripture to mind. The Lord's faithfulness will endure forever. Begin to sing it. Begin to dance it. Begin to say it as you're walking down, or pray it as you're walking down the halls of your business. And as you're doing that and you're realizing you're bringing into agreement, as the Lord lays on your heart somebody, as you walk through a circumstance, then testify the testimony of Jesus into that person's life, into that circumstance. Guys, this is something that we can find delight in. You know, so many times in the House of Prayer movement, we see that you can get so focused on the four walls that we're praying in and fighting those battles in that we forget there's a whole world around us that's moving. There's beauty and ugliness, and there's amazing things happening and hard things that are happening. And we can get so caught up into the battle being fought in those four walls that we forget that love has something to say. That love requires of us, God requires of us, and he's requiring of us as artists, as creatives. He's requiring of us not just to adore Jesus. Let's start there. But also to testify, to be sensitive, to hear what he has to say to our family, to our congregations, to our communities, to the nations around us. Guys, I believe that this gift is going to begin to operate in ways we've never seen before. That just as the worship movement and the prayer movement, I mean, think about it. We're adoring Jesus like never before. We're talking about hearing and listening to Jesus, having conversations over and over all through our day without Jesus. And there's an increase in the body of Christ for that. Of course, why isn't there going to be an increase of what Jesus' heart is to the nations around us? Prophecy, it's coming forth. It's going to come forth like a wave upon wave, and we get to be a part of it. I mean, think about it. That's the amazing thing, that when we're adoring God, we get to hear his heart and we get to see it come to pass. It brings us back into deeper worship to go, oh my gosh, you are faithful. You said you'd be faithful, and look at your faithfulness. When all of that is operating together, there is a delight that he delights in us like never before. And it causes our heart to keep saying yes again and again and again. So move in your gift. Ask him for it. God, speak to me. God, give me encounters where I can speak your testimony into people's lives. Seek these things. Paul told us to seek it, to desire it. Desire it with a boiling over again and again. Seek after these things.